screen because I have a little PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. Is that coming through? Is that visible?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, well, I'll actually try to make it full screen. Here we are. Okay, this is me. I'm now Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney in Australia. I've been a member of the National Tertiary Education Union for quite a while, and they kindly made me a life member, which I regard as an important qualification. This is my home country. In the course of climate change, and Australia is famous for devastating bushfires and devastating floods, both, and the rate at which we are getting both at the moment seems to be increasing. Modern Australia is mainly a settler colonial country, though it has also an indigenous population. And has been part of the British Empire. We still have the British flag in our national flag, very anachronistically, after more than 200 years of settlement. We do not seem to have achieved much cultural independence. Anyway, I want to talk about the concept of the Global South, partly by talking about the history of ideas about global difference. Then say a little about why this having such a concept is important, and then make some reflections and perhaps give a little bit of advice to people who might be using them. I guess most cultures have a name for outsiders. The one that I know best is the ancient Greek term barbarein, which means speaking a non-Greek language, and which is the origin of the modern English term barbarian. Which tells you something of the attitude that was embedded in that term over a couple of thousand years. But the modern concept of the global South really derives much more recently than that. It derives from 500 years of European imperialism, including both overseas imperialism, such as illustrated by the Dutch United East Indies Company, basically, the origin of the Dutch conquest of what is now Indonesia, the biggest in population terms Muslim majority country in the world. But it's also a history of overland imperialism, which we often forget because the Russian Empire was an important part of the history of imperialism, but so was the United States, which originally began as a small British settlement and then conquered most of North America, occupying the areas that taking the land from indigenous people. So when you actually look into the history of it, imperialism continued expanding. Empires continued expanding in global terms up until about 1940. Was, I think, about the maximum extent. So it's really part of modern history and not just something of the distant past with wooden sailing ships. From the 1940s, of course, that expansion stopped and reversed. In the 1940s, the largest in population terms process of formal decolonization occurred in South Asia, producing the modern states of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and some smaller ones. The 1940s also saw the intensification of the conflict between capitalist powers and the revolutionary regime in Russia, the expansion of communist control into Eastern Europe, and the creation of a global structure, which was often called in the Soviet term of the time, the two camps of capitalist imperialism on one hand, the socialist camp on the other, the two great blocks of Cold War politics from the 1940s to the 1990s. But there was also something else going on, and this is where the story becomes interesting for us, I think. In 1950, this man wrote for the United Nations a famous document. His name is Raúl Prebisch. He's an economist from Argentina. And he wrote a document titled The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems, which became quite famous. Among other things, he became head of the Center for the Economic Development of Latin America, and eventually the Caribbean was added. The Economic Commission for Latin America was its original title. And his analysis of the economic situation of Latin America developed and popularized a model of the world economy having an economic center, which is basically the United States and associated advanced capitalist countries, though in 1950, the European capitalist countries were still pretty devastated by the fighting in Europe during the war. The center on one hand and the periphery on the other. And Prebisch developed a model of the structural difference in the economies in the center and the periphery, both capitalist principally, but nevertheless different and related in the relation of domination and subordination. But the center of it was the notion of economic difference. Just a couple of years later, a French journalist, if you'll forgive my French pronunciation, by the name of Alfred Sauvy, I think, coined the term tiers-monde, third world, which in his usage was based on an old French concept, the tiers-état, which the third estate, which basically meant the commons, as distinct from the aristocracy and the monarchy and so forth. Evolved, I suppose, into the Marxist concept of the bourgeoisie, but it was a term in use at the time of the French Revolution. So they applied this, expanded this concept, if you like, to a world scale, and popularized the term third world, which is, of course, still in use for the poorer part, but especially the disenfranchised parts of the world in comparison with the great power. So the concept there was both economic and political difference. And this was a little bit, if you like, precocious or forward-looking of the journalist involved, because just 3 years later, there was the Bandung Conference called by President Sukarno of Indonesia and attended by Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Zhou Enlai, I think, from China, and a whole series of heads of government from Asia and Africa, independent or soon to be independent regimes. Sukarno spoke of this as a conference of the newly emerging forces. And the point was that this was not the United States and its immediate allies, and it was not the Soviet Union and its immediate allies. And the political world began to speak of a non-aligned bloc, as well as the Soviet bloc and the United States capitalist bloc. So we had then a model of a 3-faction world, if you like. And these concepts began to come together in popular thinking in journalism, but also in political reality in the mid-1960s, when the United Nations, which had not been involved in setting up the Bandung Conference, because it was at the time dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, but the United States, under pressure from the non-aligned countries, set up United Nations Committee on Trade and Development with the idea of developing economic policy in the interests of the poorer countries in the world. And they appointed Raúl Prebisch, no less, as secretary, as the head of this organization. And he developed for the non-aligned poorer countries of the world a trade and industrialization policy, and persuaded, although he didn't have a great deal of success in changing the trade policies of the major powers, he had a certain degree of success in circulating the idea of an agenda of autonomous industrialization for poorer countries, and in shifting some of the terms of trade policy in their interest. This was driven by a group in the United Nations called the Group of 77, the G77. And it was in this context that the Global South, the term Global South, came into popular use to describe the G77 and why they were different from the United States bloc and the Soviet bloc. So there was, if you like, both a new identity forming in politics and economic strategy, which was associated with this term, Global South. It wasn't universally accepted. The World Bank, for instance, and aid agencies, multilateral aid agencies in the 60s didn't like this terminology and didn't very much speak of the Global South. What they spoke, the language they used, was underdeveloped countries or less developed countries. And in effect, they were using a kind of modernization theory, assuming that underdeveloped countries would eventually become properly developed countries, follow the normative model of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, which was emerging as a modern industrial power again at this stage. Well, the Chinese weren't very happy about this because Group 77 wasn't necessarily aligned with them. And around 1974, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, who was not yet out of power, proposed another way of thinking about the world. They spoke of the three worlds, which was a concept already in use, I suppose, but organized it rather differently. They distinguished the superpowers, by which they meant the United States and the Soviet Union, the rich capitalist countries, by which they basically meant Western Europe and perhaps places like Australia, and thirdly, all the rest, which of course included China and the Group of 77 and anyone else who was hanging around and wasn't a rich country. Well, that concept circulated a bit, but never got the grip that the concept of the Global South had. But in the 1980s, of course, the Soviet Union was moving towards collapse. Chinese had sharply distinguished themselves from the Soviet Union and were beginning to follow their own path of change under Deng Xiaoping. And the capitalist world was pretty much taken over politically by a new set of economic and social strategies, which is often called neoliberalism, which in international terms was called the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. The term globalization came into use initially in journalism about multinational corporations as a strategy that they were now following to extend their activities across the whole world. The term globalization came in at much the same time as deregulation, financialization, and the sell-off of publicly owned assets became normal policy in the richer capitalist countries. And in the 1990s, as all of this was consolidated and became political normality in many parts of the world, including now Russia, the concept of globalization became quite orthodox in social science as well. And it strikes me that globalization is a kind of absolutely antithetical concept to the concept of the global south or the global north, because it presupposes basically that economic and political and cultural patterns are becoming homogenized or all mixed up together in an unstructured way. And there was a lot of enthusiastic writing about globalization back in the 1990s, which presented this as sort of a fact about the way the world was now, that there was no longer a north or south, but there was a north in the south, and there was a south in the north, and everything was getting scrambled up together. So at that point, many sociologists, that's my discipline, had given up using terms like centre and periphery or global north, global south. But they have been revived. There's been a very significant revival of that kind of terminology in the last 20 years, though with varying terms in use. Nevertheless, the way of thinking that looks to global structures of inequality, the persistence of imperialism and imperial and colonial relationships, that has become much more widespread. So we're now talking about Southern theory or about decolonial theory, post-colonial theory has revived. African intellectuals often talk about Afrocentrism, so forth. People looking across the global south speak of south-south connections and so forth. So varied language has now been developed. And I want to offer a few thoughts on why that these concepts have revived after the hegemony of the language of globalization, and why we actually need a concept of this kind, whatever specific language we use, why something like this is needed. This is what a sociologist from Peru called Aníbal Quijano, unfortunately died not long ago, who's celebrated particularly internationally for developing the concept of the coloniality of power, a term that he developed to describe the way in Latin American history formal independence from the colonial power did not end the orientation to the former imperial centre and didn't restructure the institutions of former colonies in a radical way. The orientation to the global centre persisted in terms of economic structure, culture, political structures, and so forth, even if the central hegemonic imperial power itself might change from Spain, for instance, to the United States. Nevertheless, the imprint of colonial subordination remained in the institutions of the former colonies. That was Quijano's concept of the coloniality of power. And the term has now been generalized too, to people often now speak of the coloniality of culture. There is an argument about the coloniality of gender, how gender structures in former colonies remain structured in the way that the colonial power imprinted on them, and so forth. So we have to recognize, as a fact that's now well documented, the political, economic, cultural histories of colonized societies have still been taken the shape that was given to them by 500 years of imperialism or economic domination. You can't shake that off just by becoming politically independent. The second point, which directly speaks to the concept of globalization, is that huge inequalities remain even in globalized parts of our social order, such as the global economy, financialized, tied together now by absolutely massive, unprecedented levels of commodity exchange, long-distance circulation, of raw materials, global. I mean, think of a container ship, think of a pipeline. You're looking at a technology of global circulation of material goods, quite not even taking account of the enormous interconnection of financial markets and powers that have happened in the same time. What you're looking at there is a famous moment in this, where the military dictator of Chile, the gentleman on the right, President Pinochet, General Pinochet, is speaking to his economic advisors, a young bunch who made a lot of money, known ironically in Chile as the Chicago Boys, because they were thought to be reproducing the ideas of the Chicago School economists in the United States. In other words, they introduced, Pinochet and the Chicago Boys introduced the world's first fairly thoroughly neoliberal economic policy in the global south, not the global north. So there is a history of neoliberalism in the global south, which you won't hear about if you only read global north accounts of the history of neoliberalism from people like Foucault. Finally, and this is what matters, I suppose, most to us as intellectuals and university workers, knowledge itself has been changed by the history of empire. This is a point that I learned especially from Pauline Ntonji from Benin in West Africa, who developed the concept of which other thinkers have called academic dependency,